Welcome to Contrarian Humanitarian, your blog and podcast for all things international development, analyzing global injustices and building solutions for a better world. Love that beat. Shout out to Franco Beats for that classic instrumental Contrarian Humanitarian intro. Thank you, everybody, for joining us again, Contrarian Humanitarian Live, Episode 4. I am your host, Erin Edmiston, and as always, I'm joined by my trusty master producer, Mikey P.
Hello, good to be here. Thanks for joining us.
All right, so let's set up today's show. We have a great show with Eric Thomas Chester, who is a former economics professor, archival research historian, author of several books, including the book that provides the backdrop for our conversation today, which is The Covert Network, Progressives, the International Rescue Committee, and the CIA, published in 1995. So yes, like I said, this provides the backdrop of the conversation we're going to have about the nefarious relationship of the CIA and International Rescue Committee. But the name of this podcast is CIA, INGOs, and Labor Movement. So next week, we're going to have our second episode with Eric Thomas Chester, and we'll also be joined by our previous guest, Dan Kovalik, and we're going to talk about Eric Chester's more recent work, his book called Wobblies in Their Heyday. It's about the industrial workers of the world during World War I era. So we're going to be talking about important labor movements. Dan is also going to be talking about some labor movements, and we're going to kind of bookend today's conversation next week with some more conversations about INGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. So that's what we have going on today and next week. Everybody, please, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe on all of our platforms. We're on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Also follow us on our own contrarianhumanitarian.org page, where you can subscribe for our monthly newsletters and become a site member. Also, special shout out to Red Library Podcast. You can find them at Red Library Pod. And let me get there. They are a political education podcast for today's leftist organizers, theorists, activists, and vagabonds. So please check them out. And we want to give them a special thank you because they introduced us to our special guest today, Eric Thomas Chester. So shout out to them and the solidarity. All right. Anything else, Mikey, for kind of logistics intro?
No, I think that's about it. Also follow us on Twitter. Don't forget about Twitter.
Yeah. Twitter's the one I'm the worst at.
Yeah. And if you go to contrarianhumanitarian.org, you can sort of join our community there, subscribe to the newsletter, our monthly newsletter. You can see our past library of podcasts and blogs and web episodes and everything. And maybe get a little space away from all the other social media. So
yeah, definitely.
I think you want to talk a little bit about this episode being kind of personal and the fact that you are a former employee of IRC, and that's why we moved out to Colorado and why we're here.
Yeah. Okay, so I have been in refugee resettlement work. So for a number of years now, I primarily worked at a resettlement organization called Church World Service, after which I wanted to understand, migration policy, essentially on a more macro scale. So I got a master's of international development policy at Duke University, where I was able to study international development policy, all over the globe and understand and study a little bit more in depth the refugee resettlement program in the US as well. And so after grad school, typical grad student looking for a job. And I thought a lot, all through grad school, I thought about my next job. And I knew the next job, might not be the end all be all, my favorite job I've ever taken. But I did put a lot of thought into my next steps. And ultimately, I decided on the IRC for a number of reasons to tailor my job search to include IRC anyway. I decided to include IRC in my job search because I wanted to continue with refugee resettlement. And the International Rescue Committee is the largest resettlement organization. And they are a secular organization. So predominantly a lot of organizations in the resettlement business were found by religious institutions, and not docking any religious person who feels a humanitarian, pull, and they do it through their religious beliefs or their values. But I personally just wanted something a little bit away from that. And IRC is quite research heavy. In fact, they have, I think, the largest sort of research hub in terms of refugee and migrant issues, especially refugee resettlement, which is not really studied. So the fact that they kind of have anything at all and are trying to put forth evidence-based programs really spoke to me. So for those reasons, I thought, okay, let's check out IRC. And then I looked more into IRC. And if you go on their page, or if you go on their Wikipedia page, they put in quite a bit of work to showcase their more, I would say, left-leaning socialist inclinations. They really tout that they were kind of founded by Albert Einstein, when in fact there are so many people that went into what is now the International Rescue Committee. It wasn't just Albert Einstein. We'll talk about that more today. So yes, all in all, I wanted something a little bit more secular, research-based. And I thought that, the IRC kind of spoke to me for that, especially their sort of socialist beginnings. And that was all I found. And not that I thought they were going to be a perfect organization, but, a step for me in the right direction. And I thought that I would be in an environment to really produce a lot of change, because at this point, going to IRC, I was ready to hit the ground running. Like I said, I had years of experience. I just had a master's degree. I'd also worked with a state refugee office. And not to mention, I, have myself kind of traveled in multiple places around the world with colleagues and with friends, seeing the kind of entire process of resettlement and where people are, what camps are like, what urban refugee settings are like. So all that to say, I think I have a fairly, a bigger understanding of what's at stake and what's needed. So I was ready to get the ball rolling. And I thought, because of more of their socialist, leftist early days, I thought, people would be very receptive to the kind of change I was talking about. And some people were, and some people totally were not. And that was primarily with management. And this gets into what we're talking about today, to kind of understand where management historically is coming from and why IRC is not well placed for radical change in the industry. I will say, of the resettlement organizations, they do push forth a bit more progressive ideas. And in fact, Biden yesterday just said that he does want to resettle 125,000 refugees by fiscal year 2022. And obviously IRC is in support of that. And they went ahead and put forth sort of policy plans they hope that to put in place that will modernize the refugee resettlement system. Some of those are really good. I would highly encourage people to take a look at that. So again, there are ways that they are quite progressive, but at the end of the day, the structure is such, and the relationships of the people at the top, the board of directors and the CEO, are people that are essentially going to continue Western imperialism, American imperialism. They're going to solidify their place in the INGO world by aligning with the United States government in whichever way they see fit. And again, that's why Eric Thomas Chester, who has done archival research, is going to be here to really provide a robust discussion on where the IRC comes from and how they operate. So I'm really excited about this. You know, I've talked about IRC a lot. It's a kind of a big stepping stone for me in the creation of Contrarian Humanitarian, but it's not just about IRC. It's just kind of, it's, you know, today is about IRC, but what Contrarian Humanitarian is about and what this conversation ultimately is about is to say that real injustices are happening and real people need real help. And we can't afford to always believe progressive rhetoric from INGOs when we know that they have a vetted interest and have already, you know, signed over their commitment to the United States government. So I hope this is educational for everybody. It's very educational for me. I would encourage everybody to read Covert Network by Eric Thomas Chester. It's original research. It's very good. And yeah, I hope that this is just a really great learning lesson for, well, for humanitarians, but for really anybody that's interested in this kind of stuff. So I need to be cautious of time, so try to pack a big intro before we talk to Eric Thomas Chester. Mikey, is there anything else you wanted to say before we bring Eric on?
Just a couple things. I would say, you know, personally, none of this stuff really surprises me about the IRC. Perhaps Aaron and I should have had like a deeper discussion before moving out here. But it's also like, Aaron was looking to do work in refugee resettlement, and there's only so many avenues to do that in the United States. So you're either going to be working directly for the government, like a state refugee office. You're going to be working for a less secular, historically organization like the one that Aaron worked for before, which is basically secular now, but is called Church World Service and has this history of religious past, or, you know, IRC. So there wasn't a whole lot of options there, so I didn't really think much to like dig super deep into the history, but I am suspicious generally of humongous international, you know, NGOs, because they're largely not actually non-governmental, which is what I think we're going to talk about today. And the graphic I chose with Lenin and was it Hamilton, I think, for this episode, the reason I did that is because so much of this relates to the Cold War, and even going back before the Cold War to the sort of rivalry between the West and the fear of communism, particularly after the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, which goes way back before World War II. And that really frames so much of the discussion we're going to have today, and helps to explain why our IRC sort of developed the way it did, which also includes a lot of alliances with some very right-wing powers, which is sort of like the theme of global history over the last 75 years or so, is that, you know, when the United States wasn't directly aligned with the Soviet Union fighting against fascism, they were basically aligned with fascism fighting against the Soviet Union for, you know, the rest of history all through the Cold War. And things function largely the same post-Cold War, which is interesting to me. And on the same sort of model of, you know, well, this country is under threat of Russia, so we have to support sanctions, or we have to support, you know, undermining that government, overthrowing that government. And then what happens is there's refugees, and then organizations like IRC step in and say, hey, here we are. And there's a lot of close connections between all these things. And that's what we're going to get into today. And that's what I have to say about it.
Yes. And just a final thought, something, again, why we're doing Contrarian Humanitarian, why we're pointing out injustices perpetrated by INGOs and giving people a more historical, contextual understanding of where these INGOs are operating from, is because essentially, one of the big reasons for me is that we've seen global poverty not decrease. But in the international development sphere, humanitarian sphere, you will see a lot of large institutions touting the decrease in global poverty. And this number, I don't want to get into, I highly encourage everybody to read Philip Alston's recent special rapporteur report. A special rapporteur is someone that goes on an investigation for the UN about a specific theme. And he was a special rapporteur on poverty. So he was already expertise in this area and then did a report. And his findings are quite abysmal. And essentially, he shows that what a lot of us realize and can see quite plainly in our everyday lives, that the top 1% wealth has grown. And the bottom 1% have like less than 50% of the entire wealth in the world. So just think about that. Half of the people in the world live on the equivalent of $5.50 of USD a day. And when the top 1% is getting all the money and we see half the world is only living on the equivalent of $5.50 a day, something is incredibly wrong with our international development humanitarian assistance. And it's not just the way we're, quantifying these values. So again, what's at stake is real. I just can't emphasize that enough. So without further ado, I hope please everybody give a warm welcome to our guest for today and for next week, Eric Thomas Chester.
Hello.
Hello.
Is the audio good? Is it coming through?
I can hear you great. Can you hear us?
Yeah, no problem.
Wonderful. Well, good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So I want to start out, if you could give your, let everybody know sort of how you got interested in researching IRC, kind of a bit of your family ties with it.
Okay, well, actually, I started doing this research in the late 1980s, so quite a while ago. It was actually my second book, and my first one about the intelligence community. So it was, to me, a real new experience trying to investigate this. I guess two things about the IRC in particular that intrigued me was, first, that it was started by socialists. And so I wanted to look at the way that people who viewed themselves as socialists, and thus outsiders, were integrated into the mainstream and wound up were in an organization that worked closely with the CIA. That question intrigued me then, still intrigues me. So that's one reason I picked the IRC. And the other reason is my parents came over on a visa that was granted to the Emergency Rescue Committee, which was the immediate predecessor of the IRC. So the reason I'm here is those visas. So that made it also an interesting. And I sort of vaguely knew that. My parents didn't talk much about their past, but I knew vaguely that they had come over on a visa related to one of the rescue committees. And so that also intrigued me to find out more about their organization. Those were the two things that led me initially to start investigating the International Rescue Committee. I have to say that now, looking back at my book and the research, it is intriguing to me how many different facets of U.S. foreign policy the IRC got involved in. But I didn't know that when I started. That wasn't what initially got me going. But now that I've done it, I just happened by chance stumbled across an organization that you look at it and it's revealing a lot about U.S. foreign policy in World War II and in particular in the post-war period.
Mm-hmm. And so how did you because you did original archival research. So how did you go about that process with the IRC? Because I said, like myself, I tried to look up the IRC before joining, and I get their website and a Wikipedia page. So how did you get all the goods?
Well, this is the kinds doing historical research is something you learn by doing. I don't think there's actually a course that you just have to start doing it. So, really, I just started looking around, looking for where the papers of various people were that were instrumental in the IRC. And just over the last week, when I started going back over this stuff, I found some more papers that actually maybe came about later or I didn't see. You'd be surprised, actually, even though this is, in fact, a very secretive organization inside. Nonetheless, key people in it collect papers. They die. They leave their papers to various universities, and there they are. So that's really mainly most of it. I don't think I got a lot. I've done a lot of research in the National Archives recently, dealing with World War I. But I don't believe the IRC stuff primarily came from that. It came from personal papers of key people.
Interesting. Yeah, I have to ask, and you were just talking about you even found more information, because so much of the original research that you have and the correspondence between different players in and out of the IRC, you kind of have, some of it's more explicit and some of it's a little more overt or covert, kind of in between the lines. So what was that process for you? Did you kind of read something and think it was more benign, and then later you found something out and realized, oh no, that's what they were talking about,
And that's really what happens as you do research on a particular topic. You start finding out what are the interconnections between various people, what's going on beneath the surface. I guess part of it is I start out with any research project assuming that there's much more beneath the surface than there is on top of the surface. I don't care what the topic is. You give me virtually any historical project, and I'll take that as a given. And it's almost always true. It is. It's just almost always true. And I have to say that includes left-wing groups. I've done a lot of research in the IWW. And while they were somewhat open about what they were doing, not entirely, a lot of stuff was going on. That's just the way things are. So I always start with that assumption. And of course I did that with the IRC. So as you do the research, you start figuring out what are the connections. So now when I go back, and it's been a long while, but even so, oh yeah, that connects with that, connects with that. Mm-hmm. That's just the way it is. That's what it means to do historical research.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into it. So the kind of inception of IRC starts sort of before World War I, before World War II. So could you, and you say in your book, and I think this is so true, because the first part of the book really lays out the geopolitical landscape to give people an understanding of how IRC could come about and how they would begin to align themselves with the CIA. So could you just set up that landscape, maybe some key players, time periods, what was happening?
So it really started in the 1930s. And one of the things that was interesting is that the kernel, I guess, the embryo of the IRC actually didn't start in the United States. It started in Germany. And there was a small group that was a split off of the Communist Party. Probably most of your listeners are not going to know the ins and outs of Communist Party politics, but it happened to be people were aligned with Bukharin, who was once a big figure in the Bolshevik Party, but was squeezed out by Stalin. So some of his supporters in Western Europe began to form little Bukharin groups. And there was one in Germany, and in 1931, it was already becoming very repressive. And they started going semi-underground, and they wanted to get some help, funds from outside. And they contacted the similar group in the United States that was controlled by this guy called J. Lovestone, who was a big wheel in the Communist Party USA, was expelled and had his own little group. So anyway, they contacted him, and that was really the start. It was called the International Relief Association. And it was Lovestone and his friends funneling money to a small group in Germany that was doing underground work. actually a good thing to do, right? And that's how
Right.
it started. Yeah, that's how it
Right.
started.
So it does start, very well-meaning. Okay. There's people that are in, political trouble or just, need to get out. And so we're going to figure out ways to allow these people to safety. Right.
Well, actually, originally it was not to get to safety. It was actually to provide them with funds so they could work underground in Germany. Now, after Hitler and the Nazis consolidated power, then they started leaving, and then to Paris mostly. And then, yes, the funds that were going to help to subsidize them to live in Paris. But initially, actually, it was to do underground work in Germany. That was the idea.
Okay. So in terms of underground work, what exactly do you mean? Like conspiring against Stalin, or what?
Well, into almost everything was illegal in Nazi Germany. So putting out a newspaper, for instance, that would have to be done underground. Flyers, any kind of propaganda kind of work was illegal. Holding a demonstration, of course, even the smallest one was totally illegal. Everything was illegal, so you had to be underground. So, yeah, so that's what they were doing. Then they were putting out like newsletters and, trying to maintain an organization. Trade unions, the working class in Germany was generally left, and CP had a pretty big support within Germany, and this is a split off of the CP, so they would have had people in workplace shop floors. They would try and maintain contact with them, all that kind of stuff, just underground work, So, and it all required some money, and that's where Lovestone came in.
Right. So Lovestone is a key player. Who are some other key players in this period? And when does Albert Einstein come into play?
Okay, so in 1933, they actually decided to set up an official American version of this German, later Paris organization. And to launch it, they, tried to raise funds, of course. They got Einstein to sign on some kind of endorsement, so they could, put an ad in the paper or that kind of stuff. That was his role. He just endorsed some kind of fundraising statement that the IRA put out. He was a key person in terms of world history, but not particularly in terms of this. So I was amused that the IRC said they helped to found it. That's silliness, but they didn't have. But he signed off on some, you see him now, ads in the paper that'll have like 50 signatures. That's what he did. So anyway, so the secretary of this outfit, the American version that is, was Shiva Strongski, who was around the Lovestone group. And she was involved with the IRC and its predecessors from 33 to 48. And so she was an important person in it. And she, as I said, she was close to Lovestone. That was why she was doing this. But it was, again, we're talking really small. That's one of the things I find intriguing. Now that I look at it, it's what's interesting about, and one of the things interesting about the IRC, you talk about a small, tiny little group of lefties that has now morphed into this giant organization with thousands of people and hundreds of millions of dollars. Amazing, really, when you think about it. Really amazing.
Definitely. I think their latest budgets were in the billions, like 1 or 2 billion. They're the largest resettlement organization now. They're operating in 40 countries and 26 cities across the United States. So, they've come a long way.
A long, long way. A long, long way.
Right.
Anyway, go quickly through this part of the history. Lovestone started moving more and more into the mainstream, and he became sort of connected to some of the leading AFL, American Federation of Labor leaders. And so while originally the funding was to help this little group in Germany of Bukharin supporters, then it became more and more the official Social Democrats. Of course, by now they're in Paris, right? So once Hitler came to power, everybody on the left had to either die or leave. So a lot of people were in Paris, and so they were funneling money to the Social Democrats in Paris. So this is where it gets more complicated. So in June 1940, the Germans took over France, northern part of France. I have to say my parents were in Paris, and they had to flee south. with thousands of other lefties and Jews. And so there they were in southern France, Marseille in particular. And there was a brief respite where Vichy France, which was like an artificial construct that the Nazis set up for southern France, but it had a certain amount of autonomy at first, certain amount. So all these people were flooding into Marseille, but who knows how long that was going to last before the Nazis, started moving them to the Auschwitz. So some people on the left got the idea of how do we get them out? And they felt that the IRA was too sectarian. It was too linked to the Lovestone group. I mean, you needed something broader. And that's where the Emergency Rescue Committee came about. So a bunch of people, most of whom were out of the Socialist Party, not the Communist Party, but the Socialist Party, created this group called the Emergency Rescue Committee with the idea of getting people out of southern France. And they had connections to Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt, you were talking, Mike, about ties to fascists. What intrigues me is not so much the ties to right-wingers, so you sort of expect that. The number of times you find progressives who are involved in this kind of intelligence kind of community, I find that more interesting. So Eleanor Roosevelt shows up frequently in IRC history, and she was there at the very beginning because some of these former socialists got to her, who got to FDR, and convinced them to give these visas. And part of the visas were for famous people. Marc Chagall was one of them, the painter, various authors, all that's on the up and up. But some of the visas were particularly for lefties who the government, the US government, thought might be useful in the coming war. They had skills that would be useful and contacts that would be useful. And, Roosevelt wasn't stupid. He knew that the war was around the corner. So that's what the visas were for. And some were given to the IRA, a lot were given to the Emergency Rescue Committee. So already you can see that even though these people are, I'm sure, well-meaning, see themselves still as socialists, they are playing a dangerous game because this is not really refugee work. Real refugee work doesn't figure out who to rescue on the basis of who might be useful to the U.S. military intelligence community. That's, not the criteria. But that was, in fact, the criteria that the Emergency Rescue Committee was operating under.
Right. Absolutely. Those are you just spoke on two themes that I really want to get into that I loved in your book. What you were just saying about how, right, that's not real refugee resettlement work, that you get to pick and choose which refugees you're assisting and which ones you're not. And throughout the book, in various contexts, you see IRC agreeing that they are going to use certain intellectual or, refugees that would be beneficial for the United States propaganda. They'll pick those first, and even giving the CIA access to camps to interview people to see who might be useful. I mean, that's just a humanitarian principle that you would never just allow government entities to, see information they can find from refugees in a camp, But yeah, there's multiple humanitarian concerns that IRC gets into. But the other theme that you brought up that I am really interested in your opinion, because throughout the book, you do continually see progressives or social dems keep moving to the right or just aligning with, government, U.S. government, imperialist wishes, I guess. And I just keep wondering, why? Why are they moving this way? Especially because one of the things you point out in your book is that there was sizable left communities in Europe, right? So that there could have been, I guess maybe the environment was such that there was more lefties they potentially could have partnered with rather than moving towards more conservative, social democrat way. Do you understand what I'm saying?
No, I don't think that gets to the point. That's true. That's the fact that there were left communities in Europe was exactly what made those lefty refugees in Marseille attractive to the U.S. government, because they saw them as links between the two. But for the people who were in that position and the people in the United States who were working with them, they saw correctly that the United States was the power. It was an enormous, powerful state. And then there was the Nazis, or then after World War II, it was the Soviet Union, So they had to, from their point of view, they had to figure out how they could do whatever good work was possible while not antagonizing the people who really held power, which were those, in the White House and around, and the corporations as well. But so that's really, that was it. So sure, they knew that there were, France in particular, there was all kinds of left kind of activity going on, but that wasn't the point. It was World War II, right? So you had Germany, which was, not to downplay. Nazis were a powerful force. And there was the United States. And so you were caught in between the two. Now, there were a few people on the left who said, I'm not going to play that game. I'm not willing to do it. But they were very few. So most people decided, well, they might not like it, but that's the way it is. And the problem is once you start going down that road, the ante keeps getting upped. And so you wind up doing more and more things. So that's one of the things that's interesting about the IRC. They did far more during the Civil War. It wasn't just that they allowed the CIA people to interview refugees in the camps. And that was at least refugee-related work. They did a lot of stuff that was only, it wasn't really refugee work. It was just CIA covert operation work. And so where does that end? So once you start, and that's what I was making about the Emergency Rescue Committee. Once the ERC people, who I'm sure were with the best of intentions, nonetheless, when they bartered with the White House that they were going to get these visas on the basis of what would help the U.S. military and intelligence community, they were heading down a very dangerous path. Because the logic of that is that next step, more cooperate, and you wind up in some very dirty stuff.
Right. And something you point out is that, the tactics being deployed overseas will be deployed against American citizens. And when you continually agree, keep moving and moving, in the environment of pre-World War II, World War II, people are aligned mostly against fascism or against Nazism because that's, and there's not much to exactly blame people for wanting to go against fascism or Nazism at that time. It's of course very understandable that there's this, literal big bad guy and we need to do what we can to take him out. But then, as you said, later on,
well, even during World War II, I think there's some question. When Varian Fry was the guy who the Emergency Rescue Committee sent with the visas to Marseille, while he was there, he didn't just pick out the ones he thought the U.S. would be helpful for the U.S. government, as dubious as that was. One of the refugees gave him a document which showed the mines in the set by the Nazis, mines that had been set in the Mediterranean, and that was very valuable espionage. Nonetheless, he's supposed to be a refugee worker, not a spy. And when you start, conflating those two, it's not surprising that governments say, well, wait a second, you guys aren't really doing refugee work. You claim to be doing refugee work, but you're actually spies. Varian Fry was acting like a spy. When he took that document and took it off to the U.S. government, he acted like a spy. Now you can say it was Nazis, all that. The fact is, he stepped beyond the bounds of what a refugee work, even the most expansive definition of what refugee work is. And that was already in 1940. We're not talking post-war, the Cold War. We're already very tricky stuff, right? So I think one of the things that, in terms of people who are listening to your podcast, you should keep in mind, refugee work should be refugee work, not spy work, even for the best of intentions. You're there to help refugees, not to pass on secret documents. That's, let the spies do that. That's their job. Your job is, and when you confuse those two, you really undercut your legitimacy with governments around the world. Frankly, if I were in a position of influence in some country and the IRC came to say I was going to help you with refugee work, I think long and hard about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen a lot of people in refugee work saying, oh, there's, I can't build trust, or they won't trust me, or this or that. And it's just like, they have every reason not to trust you, and it's things like this that have happened historically where people, begin to move beyond their humanitarian work. So yeah, there's a legacy here that I think people in this industry definitely need to understand.
Yeah, you're right. So I don't know if do we want to go through some of the post-war, Cold War stuff that the IRC was involved?
Yeah, I was just going to say, do you have anything, World War II, IRC nefarious activities that you want to touch on before getting into the Cold War?
Well, actually, the only thing that I thought was interesting was the two organizations merged in 1942, and you can imagine at whose behest that was. But the treasurer of this new organization, the International Rescue Committee, was OSS. OSS was the predecessor for CIA. Treasurer is a key post. That's an important post because that's the person who, the funds are flowing through. So when I read that, I said, now you're talking about an organization that's not just on the edges of what I call the covert network. It's well into it when you have a treasurer.
Right. They are directly receiving funds from the predecessor of the CIA to carry out these operations.
So from 43 to 46, it was openly funded by the government through the National War Fund. But it started already in 42. Anyway, to me, that was a key sign of how far things had gone already and how important even that small, still was quite small, but even that small IRC was to the powers to be, that they would make sure that the treasurer was OSS. So,
yeah, that's definitely significant.
yeah.
All right. So let's set the stage for the Cold War. So, people were aligning against fascism. The IRC was being used, essentially allowing, refugees to provide, important information to the U.S. government, or using refugees as kind of propaganda, picking and choosing intellectuals. And then we get into the Cold War, and Nazism is quote unquote defeated. So, what's the geopolitical landscape here, and how does IRC have to pivot in order to continue on?
Yeah, well, I think there was a period, say, from 46 to 48, where the IRC was sort of trying to find its way. Where did it fit into this post-war period? But it is interesting. I was looking at who joined the IRC board right after the war, and it's very much OSS types. There was this guy, Albert Jolis, Jolis, who was actually a diamond merchant. Talk about having good cover. That's really good cover. But he was connected to the OSS during World War II, and he joined the IRC board after the war. And he had a lot of friends. One of those friends was Arthur Schlesinger, a well-known historian and very much a key figure in liberal democratic politics, close advisor to Robert Kennedy and in the White House staff during the Kennedy years. So Schlesinger joined the board on the behest of Jolis. William Donovan, who was the head of OSS, joined IRC in 1948. I mean, you put Donovan on your board and you're saying, this is it. We are an intelligence agency. We're not really a refugee agency. We have direct connections, the ones that at the top. Couldn't get any higher than Donovan. So they put Donovan on board, and William Casey joined in the early 50s, and he was a big OSS person, later CIA director. So I think that was part of what was going on, is that in that period, where they're trying to figure out where they fit in, right? There's still refugees were coming across from the Soviet bloc, Eastern Europe, and they were doing their usual thing of vetting them, working closely with an organization called the National Committee for Free Europe, which had Radio Free Europe. Remember Radio Free Europe? And that was a CIA operation, straight out. No question, CIA funded, CIA directly controlled. It couldn't have been any closer than CIA. So the IRC was working with Free Europe in terms of processing these refugees as they came over. But they were still sort of looking for a place where do they fit in. And to me, one of the key points is 1949, the guy who was now executive director, succeeding Shiva Strongski, explicitly sent a memo around saying what we need to do is create a dual organization where there's a small group of people who are on the in, who know what's going on with covert operations, and then there's everybody else. And until then, it's a pretty small organization, informal, but by doing that, you're making yourself a serious operation in terms of intelligence work, because if it's going to be secret, only a few people are going to know about it. So that happened in 1949, and that's to me a really clear signal that this is an organization that's going well beyond refugee work, even refugee work related to the intelligence community. So that happened in 1949, and it's interesting. Martin later came under attack from the far right, actually Russian monarchist exiles. I don't think you could really call them fascists. They were like they were back in the 18th century somewhere. But anyway, they were very right wing. They didn't like Martin in part because he was Jewish. They were real strong anti-Semites. They felt that too many refugees that being processed by the IRC were Jewish. And also, when he was a youth in Canada, he had been a Trotskyist, radicals. They were in after him, and this is, we're entering the McCarthy period. So they sort of pushed him aside, and that's actually where they created this president. Until there was not a president of the IRC, they created this post-president so that they would have somebody in an important position who was a well-known figure, not somebody coming out of the left, but a well-known figure. So that's really where you create it. And now we have David Miliband, perfectly fits that description, but actually came out of this crisis that in the early 50s when Martin was under attack. They pushed him aside and they created this new post of president of the IRC. So you can see the process that's going on there, where they're moving further and further away from even the loose ties with the left to becoming very much a mainstream kind of organization. So there was that. And let me talk a little bit about the fighting group, because I was really, you talk about non-refugee work. So Berlin was isolated by Eastern Germany and very much open to attack. In fact, you had the airlift in 48, 49. So nonetheless, the West German government sponsored this organization called the Fighting Group Against Inhumanity, which despite its name was actually a paramilitary organization operating in West Berlin against East Berlin. Now, right there, that's just, you can't think of much more provocative actions than that. This had already nearly started World War III, and now you're sending in units to East Berlin. At first, they were doing espionage on where the Russian troops were and stuff like that. But then the CIA took it over in 1950, and they started doing arson, sabotage, what the U.S. now calls terrorism. That's what they were doing, and this was sponsored by the West German government and the CIA. So in September 1950, this guy David Martin, executive director of the IRC, came to visit Berlin because IRC did a lot of refugee work in Berlin, and Maxwell Taylor, who was a Army general, later real tight with JFK. But at that time in charge of the Allied troops in Berlin, asked Martin if the IRC would sponsor the fighting group against inhumanity. Now, this had nothing at all to do with refugee work, nothing, zero. But of course, Martin said, sounds good, right? So he had set it up so they could do real covert operation, and this was one of them. So the IRC became the sponsoring organization in the United States for a group of terrorists operating from West Berlin into East Berlin. So they had, IRC was good at media, so they had newspaper articles extolling the fighting group and fundraising campaign. Eleanor Roosevelt was involved in that again. All the kind of stuff the IRC, was good at doing for a group that was, deliberately trying to provoke the Soviet Union They were trying to, when you think about it, this is the kind of stuff that the OSS did against the Nazis. They sent in people behind the lines to blow up bridges, railroads, but it was war. There was no war at the time. And by doing this, you were moving it further towards war. Right? This is the opposite of peacemaking. It was, provocative action. So I found that to be really interesting because, again, this had nothing at all to do with refugee work, zero. And yet the IRC was more than willing to jump on board because they wanted to please, the powers that be, including the CIA. And they pursued it, and quite successfully too. They got all kinds of progressives to sign up on this organization, claiming that it was, helping, dissidents in East Berlin, which it did, but it also blew up bridges and stuff. I think very, very indicative of where things go once you start heading down that road. And what happened actually is that these Germans penetrated it. Stasi agents started catching people who came over with explosives, and they put them on trial. It was rather embarrassing, so eventually they closed it out. But so a good example, case study of what the IRC became.
Yeah. So did the IRC? Oh, sorry, I got a little bit of echo. Did the IRC? Okay, so you're saying this time the OSS goes to IRC and says, "Okay, we have this essentially paramilitary group. We want you to sign off on it, or to exactly how And you talked about IRC propaganda using this group. So how are they kind of spinning that this group fits under their structure, or what are they saying their exact role is with this group?
Well, the IRC was, from the beginning, in 1940, when the Pre-Emergency Rescue Committee was always very good at publicizing its event for fundraising. That's what it started doing. Fundraising among progressives, that's where it fundraised. So it was always very good at that. So it was actually Maxwell Taylor, was not CIA, it was Army, but acting for the CIA. But
Okay.
Saying, well, we want you to do this for the fighting group. We want you to give them a good image in the United States, give them good publicity, raise some money. But most of the money, of course, came from the CIA. But all that kind of that's what the IRC was good at. So that's what they did for the fighting group. And how did they justify it? I don't know. It was the Cold War, right? I mean, anything goes. Roll back the Russian occupation of Germany. I don't know. They justified it, or maybe they just said, "Well, look, if we want to keep in business, we better play ball with the CIA, or they're going to shut us down, and we're going to be out of a job." I don't know. So I'm not sure how they justified it. Probably on all those bases, but they did not justify it. That's the point.
Right.
They did it. Without being coerced, Martin said, "Yeah, good idea. We can do this," and they proceeded to do exactly that.
Yeah, it has kind of amazed me in your book how often the IRC is just so willing to go along. There doesn't seem to be a lot of pushback. I mean, and really, like, the only kind of any kind of pushback that I saw in the book that starts to happen is much later in Vietnam after the bombing campaign. But we'll get into that later. Again, one thing I think is interesting with refugees is not only are refugees a byproduct of war, but what I learned from your book is just how purposefully refugees are created and used in war. They're a tactic, they're a strategy, they're not just a byproduct of war. And how often refugees can be used as strategy, I found very interesting. And essentially that's what IRC was doing, is allowing refugees to be used as military tactics and propaganda strategy, both abroad and in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was just a way
most
I never.
Of the refugees were a byproduct, but you're right. They were sometimes used as strategy, and Vietnam is a good example. when the United States put Diem into power in 1954, he was Catholic in an overwhelmingly Buddhist country. So the United States actively encouraged Catholics from North Vietnam to come to South Vietnam, where they were refugees and where the IRC started working with them. So they actually created a refugee program. In that case, it wasn't a byproduct. Now, later on, the U.S. started bombing anything that moved, free fire zones. So in that case, well, it was still deliberate, but it wasn't exactly a tactic. It was just clear the area out kind of thing. But in the case of the Catholics from North Vietnam, they actively encouraged them to come to South Vietnam, where they thought that would be a base of popular support for Diem, who otherwise had none. He was not popular from the start. So, yeah, you're right. So that was used as a strategy. And also in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, during the 1950s, they actively encouraged certain key people to leave, got them out of the country. The IRC was involved in that, and then debriefed them, decided how they could be used. So in that case, they're again sort of actively encouraging, but that was a few thousand people. We're not talking large numbers. But the case in Vietnam was a lot of people, right? So and that was a case where they were using large numbers of people literally as pawns in the chess game.
Right. I definitely want to get into Vietnam, but I do have some questions still in this time period that I think I kind of wanted to go back to what you were talking about, the CIA radio operations. I found those very interesting. A few points about that I'm hoping you could further expand on. One, if you could, I thought it was interesting that for radio propaganda, it started out a bit more explicit in anti-communist rhetoric. And then I believe maybe the head of the operation kind of changed hands and they opted for a more neutral, professional type of propaganda rhetoric. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember that particular case myself. But I think you're right. At first, it was very blatant. And this also gets into the Hungarian situation. Because at first, Radio Free Europe seemed to be encouraging people to revolt against the Russians and implicitly holding out hope that the U.S. would intervene. I mean, they didn't say it explicitly, but that was sort of the implicit message. And so in 1956, when the Hungarians did revolt against the Soviet troops, the United States, was Eisenhower, then had to decide were they going to actually live up to their rhetoric or not. Now, if they were going to start sending large numbers of troops or even military supplies from Austria into Hungary, the chances of war greatly increased, So Eisenhower backed off and said, no, we won't do that. And then the Radio Free Europe, of course, started toning down what it was saying.
I just thought that was such an interesting psychological tactic that they thought, okay, we can't be as aggressive because then maybe it's more obvious that we're, presenting propaganda. So we have to, go under the auspices.
Yeah, I think actually what you were talking about had to do with AMCOM was Radio Liberation, another operation of the CIA was aimed at Russia, which did start out very strident and then was toned down because, it was crude. These people, generally are pretty sophisticated, and so they saw that was actually counterproductive. Because after all, people in Russia are used to strident propaganda. That's what they do now from Putin, and at the time they got it from the Sounds. They just, tend to block it out because they've heard that before. So it was more useful to actually have it more objective and less strident. Yeah.
The other thing I was hoping you could, sorry.
Well, I don't know if we want to get into the Hungary thing, because I did think it is a key moment in the Cold War where the United States had to grant that Eastern Europe was controlled by the Soviet Union and that they would not militarily engage in that. Until that time, that was unclear. But in 1956, as the people were in the streets in Budapest, the United States had and there was Frank Wisner, the head of CIA operations, wanted to send in more, and Eisenhower said no. So that was a big step. Now, to bring the IRC in, the IRC, the chair of the IRC, Leo Chern, went into Budapest while it was still in flux. And what's interesting, I thought, was that he spent most of his time talking with conservatives, Catholic-oriented conservatives who were fighting the Russians, and not with the Social Democrats, who also had a lot of the units who were fighting the Russians. Now, that is a complete reversal of the IRC. I mean, the IRC was set up to deal, with Social Democrats and people to the left of Social Democrats. Here, Chern was going in, and he deliberately, avoided the Social Democrats and went for the conservatives. And he wasn't just talking with them; he brought medical supplies, which were urgent, since the Russians, were engaging in firefights. So that was, I thought that was very revealing as to how the IRC had changed. Now, the reason they didn't give it to the Social Democrats is the Social Democrats were working with the opposition communists who were in power to create a coalition government, have a democratic society, and a neutral Hungary, all of which, well, at least the neutral Hungary part was definitely not part of the U.S. idea of what should happen to Hungary. So that's why Chern didn't deal with them. Very indicative of how far things had moved from 1940 to 1956.
Right. You have, I can't remember, sorry, if it's your quote or you're quoting the correspondence of two people where they're essentially, I think it's between a more conservative and a social dim, where the social Dems ideally want new leaders to also be social democrats because that's their ideology. But then somebody, I think it's a conservative, is like, well, what makes you think that the U.S. really cares about putting in place social democrats? We care about the short term. Do you align with U.S. interests, yes or no? That becomes their ideology.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that the Hungary thing is a good example, and so is Vietnam for that matter, where IRC winds up aligning with people who are actually quite conservative, when there were actually social democratic alternatives, but they weren't the ones that the U.S. wanted. So, part of that's what happens. You move further and further into the mainstream, and I mean, the U.S. is very pragmatic. And you look historically, I mean, they'll ally with right-wing regimes, they'll ally with social democrats, they'll ally. It's really whatever fits the immediate, it's realpolitik. So, but for those who have some kind of ideology that you're looking specifically to promote social democracy, yeah, you find out that that's not really what's on the agenda. They found that out in Hungary. They found that out in Vietnam. Now, for Chern, there was no problem. He wasn't a social democrat. So
right.
that was easy for him.
Yeah.
But for Buttinger, which we're going to get into in Vietnam, that was a real problem because he had to convince himself that Diem, who was a conservative Catholic, was somehow a social reformer. That's the kind of twist you get into.
Right. So I definitely want to get into Buttinger and Leo Chern, who also the IRC touts, which I think is very interesting because he's definitely, in the CIA essentially, or a nefarious actor. But before we get into them and kind of what happens post Cold War, I wanted to touch a little bit on kind of bringing it back to a conversation that Mikey actually had in a previous podcast about fascism, because there's this sort of debate about, is America fascist or not? Okay, well, if they didn't call themselves fascist, they certainly have operated in a fascist spirit, and then the term fascist sort of came later. But I wanted to point out, and you just said, the U.S. will align with whoever. And one thing a story I thought really interesting in your book is about, is it NTS or NST cadres?
Oh, the NTS and among Russian exiles. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you just explain a little bit about who they were and, how the United States utilized them?
Well, so when as people left the Soviet Union and went into exile, they developed a Russian exile community, and it was broken down into three different parts. One were the monarchists that we were talking about earlier, who were very right-wing, but weren't actually fascists. They were just, they wanted to recreate Tsarist Russia. Talk about vain hopes. I mean, that one had long gone, but they did. They wanted to recreate it. They thought it was really good. But and then there was the NTS, which was actually a cadre group, a very disciplined group, and it had neo-fascist politics. At one time, it actually looked towards Hitler, but they decided wisely that that was not a winning procedure, and sort of looking more to the United States. And then there were some social democrats as well. So when in the 50s, when the IRC and the CIA generally were trying to make some sense out of this mishmash of exile groups, they had to try and figure out who to deal with, and it was the three of them hate each other. The three different groups hated each other, couldn't work with each other. Forget it. And it was a problem. And I don't think they actually ever really resolved it. They tried to bring them all together. It didn't work. The point is the United States was quite willing to work with the NTS, even though it was really, you could call them fascist. But they were so sectarian that they wouldn't work with the monarchists, forget the social democrats. Exile groups, refugee groups are often like that, fractious. And they refight things that are no longer relevant, but were relevant when they were in Russia. So they never really resolved that, but they did create this radio liberation, which sent the propaganda broadcasts, I'd say, became more sophisticated after a while. I should say that George Kennan, and we've really talked about him, but he was the architect of post-war U.S. foreign policy in the State Department. He was the one who created the containment idea rather than, get into war with Russia, just try and contain. Anyway, and he was very much involved with intelligence work from the 45 to 55 era. Kennan liked the Social Democrats. He thought that this guy, Nikolaevsky, who was actually a well-known Russian intellectual, Menshevik, whatever that is in Russian politics, but he liked them. They got along well. So he would have preferred that, but they were actually a pretty small group among the exiles. And the NTS and the monarchists were bigger. So, again, as I said, Americans work with what's there, and that's what was there. So they tried to create some kind of umbrella group that didn't work. Anyway, they probably gave them, each gave them a program, radio liberation.
Right. I guess, yeah, I just want to bring it up because I guess I've just been thinking a lot about more radical groups and how the United States government, or how the mainstream government utilizes them or handles them. Mikey's talked about Hitler and the brown shirts. And then recently, with the, I don't know what to call it, but what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, where essentially Trumpists, MAGAists, whatever you'd like to call them, stormed the Capitol, and how the Republicans responded to them, I thought was interesting. And again, how Hitler responded to the brown shirts, and how the American government inside the CIA was responding to the NTS cadre, where it seemed some people were very in favor of utilizing them, and other people were like, no, these people need to go away.
Yeah, I think they wish they could go away, but they had some influence in the Russian exile community, so they felt they couldn't ignore them. Well, I don't know, to jump to the Capitol riot is a big jump from the IRC. I'm not sure I want to go there. Yeah. If you're going to raise it, maybe you can think about this, or people listening. This was not a surprise. Trump announced this rally. Everybody knew it. He was opposed to the certification of Biden's election. So they hold this rally. Nobody stopped them from getting to the Capitol. Nobody?
Right.
What's that about? I haven't heard people talk about this. An intelligence failure. It didn't take intelligence to figure out what was going on. Everybody saw what was going on, yet nothing was done. I have a suspicious mind. Let's put it that way. It doesn't smell right to me. I mean, this is a powerful government. Even the DC police could have probably handled the matter. Nothing was done. Anyway, that's a whole different topic, not the IRC topic.
Yeah, we'll get back to the IRC, but I just wanted to point out the NTS story because I thought it was really interesting. Again, I've just been sort of thinking about, the U.S. does operate very much with fringe groups and try to control them in various ways. So I just thought that was an interesting story. But
NTS is a good example of control, and they actually failed. They wanted to bring all these three groups together. They wanted an umbrella group, would look a lot better. When we get into Cuba, they did that, right? The CIA convinced all these little exile groups, I'm sure were the same way, all the past hatreds that they had and disagreements, the personality disputes, and they said, look, you want the money? You want to have an invasion? You get it together. And they did. But it didn't work with the Russian exiles. The Russians kept arguing among themselves. So these people were ideologues. They were not easily controlled.
Right. And, speaking of Cuba, we can still see the propaganda of Cuba today in every election, oh, well, they have the Hispanics except for the Cubans. The Cubans are always going to be Republican, essentially, is what, I just, you point out that.
Now, here's another question about refugees, right? So the world is filled with refugees.
Right.
Right. But the U.S. made a point of taking Cuban refugees. Now, part of that was to get back at the Castro regime. But think about it. These are probably the most right-wing refugees you can find. And I don't think that's by accident,
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly.
So,
exactly.
A million right-wing Cubans now, are a big force in Florida politics. It's not entirely by accident. So,
yeah, I think this is a good. I just want to add in, as someone who's been in this work, so many times I have been asked, "What are refugees like?" And like any group, it's not a monolith. It's not, one. But to your point, refugees are just people, and they just happen to need to live or move somewhere else because of, certain circumstances. But they're imbued with all of the, good and bad and all of the things that make us human. So just to point out, I think certain people have certain ideas of what refugees are, but they're just people with all sorts of ideas. And particularly, we see in Cuba, or recently, Mikey was just pointing out an Iranian refugee who was very much in favor of U.S. sanctions and this and that. So the U.S. has used these types of refugees for their own propaganda. Even just the other day, I was reading about how the U.S. wants to agree with Britain to bring Hong Kong refugees because China is so terrible. And, obviously, like you were saying, everything is an iceberg. We see one thing, but there's so much more that's going on. But I do think it stands to the point of look how the U.S. utilizes people and refugees, their ideas to, support their own interest and propagandize people, particularly Americans. I think it gives Americans the idea that we are exceptional or we live in an exceptional land because everywhere else is, a shithole country, essentially.
Everybody wants to come to the United States. It's true. But the Cuban thing is interesting. Contrast it to Hong Kong, for instance. In Cuba, after the revolution, there was a lot of discontent, but Fidel actually had a lot of popular support. So even though some people probably were growing increasingly disillusioned, the ones who actually wanted to leave and go to the United States tended to be the more conservative ones. And the more lefty ones, and there were lefty ones who were opposed to Castro, tended to stay and figure out, well, he can't get rid of us. We're going to stay here and fight for what we believe in. So it was an unusual situation in that way. And I don't think that Hong Kong fits that. My guess is most of the people who are being pushed out in Hong Kong are lefties. So, of course, the CIA will try and use them. That goes without saying. But these are people who are generally to the left. Critical. Hong Kong is a very divided city-state with huge discrepancies in income and wealth. And the people who are on the streets are not the ones on the top of the towers, they're the ones at the bottom. And so these are going to generally be people on the left. It is a different kind of situation.
I think you're definitely.
Yeah, you're in Europe. The refugees from the Nazis tended to be on the left as well, because the conservative ones made their peace with Hitler, right? Even if they didn't particularly like him, they made their peace with him. So lefties are left. The specific circumstance will tell you whether it's refugees generally on the left or generally on the right.
Right. I was just going to say, this fits your point. Whatever is in the interest of America, that's who they're going to align with. They'll align with a variety of ideologues. So, yeah. I would say, do you have any? I definitely, want to go into post-Cold War, all the activities that IRC did, more into Cuba and Vietnam, Persian Gulf, and everything. Do you have other things you want to say about the Cold War, maybe particularly if you could crystallize maybe the transition that IRC did have to go from World War II to CIA, or it's not from World War II to Cold War?
Well, I was saying, I think that to me, that the key one was in 1949 when the executive director said we're going to create a two-tier organization. That professionalized it. That made it a genuine organization that could deal with truly secret operations. Because obviously, if everybody on the staff, it ain't going to be secret. So to me, that was the key in 1949. At that point, they really became a Cold War organization. Not to say they weren't doing stuff before then, they were, but that really, that was a marker. So by the time they got to Vietnam, that had already been established.
And we're back. Oh, we got a comment. You feel refreshed now? 5-minute refresh. Yeah, good. Okay, so yeah, do you want to pick up in Cuba?
Let's do Vietnam first, no?
Okay, yeah, let's do Vietnam. Okay. Vietnam.
Right. I have to say I was in the anti-war movement, so for me this is directly history I experienced. So in 1954, the French that had been occupying Indochina were defeated at Dien Bien Phu by the North Vietnamese army, and they decided to leave wisely. And the United States, which until then had given the French military equipment but not combat troops, moved in. So the French left and the U.S. came in South Vietnam, and they installed this guy, Diem, who was a quite conservative Catholic, was a nationalist. He'd been in exile. They put him back into power. And the Saigon was flooded with CIA people. So IRC had never done anything out of Europe. That was their whole raison d'etre, to deal with European refugees. But the United States government asked them to come into Vietnam, and they did. So that was a big breakthrough. Again, you're talking before about how IRC is now all over the world. That really started in 1954 when they decided to go into Vietnam. And their particular thing, as we were talking before, the United States had created these refugees, Catholics coming from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. And the IRC was supposed to help the refugees, but also pick out which ones who could be useful, propagandistically, otherwise. So that was their immediate thing. So they sent Joseph Buttinger. Now, Buttinger, also a very interesting character. I would have loved to meet him, but he was Austrian, and he had been the leader of the Austrian Socialist Underground when it was prior to Hitler occupied in Austria in 1938, but in 1934 you already had a fascistic government, not a German Hitler, but a fascistic government, and the socialists were underground. So he was the leader of the socialist underground. And then when Hitler came to Austria in 1938, he left, wound up in the United States in 1940, joined the Emergency Rescue Committee, was vice chair of the International Rescue Committee. So he's already come a long way from being an underground socialist activist. Anyway, and he was in charge of post-war of the IRC program dealing with refugees coming from the Soviet bloc in the first few years. So they sent him to South Vietnam, to Saigon. And he knew nothing about Vietnam. Needless to say, didn't speak Vietnamese, but I don't believe he even spoke French. I doubt it. He was working class background, didn't go to university. Nonetheless, he was an envoy from an important organization in the United States. DM knew that he was being kept in power by the United States. So Buttinger and DM spent hours together, frequent meetings, long meetings. Buttinger was there for 10 weeks in the fall of 1954, thinking of how the IRC could help DM stay in the power. Now, you couldn't think of two more unlikely people than Joseph Buttinger and DM. I mean, totally, yeah. Anyway, it would have been amazing to listen to what they would have been saying. I must have had a translator too. But anyway, so that's how the IRC got into Vietnam. And while he was in Vietnam, at that point, the U.S. presence was not military, it was CIA. There were no combat troops there. And Buttinger talked with CIA people. And one of the ideas, this guy, Edward Lansdale, who was the chief mucky-muck among the CIA people in Saigon at the time, he had this idea called Operation Brotherhood. And he was going to set up health clinics in rural zones where the Viet Cong were contesting. And it would help, good PR to set up health clinics, and also good place to get intelligence on what's going on. And actually, he was going to use Filipino doctors. Now, Lansdale had been in the Philippines just prior to Vietnam, countering insurgents there. So he had already had these ideas before them. So that was Operation Brotherhood. It was totally a CIA operation, totally funded, totally controlled. But he wanted IRC help. Now, again, this has very little to do with refugees. It was a CIA operation, hostile territory. But Buttinger agreed. So when he came back to the United States, they set up a fundraising campaign for Operation Brotherhood. They got newspaper articles that praised it. And these are, all the kinds of things that the IRC was good at, in liberal magazines now we're talking about, and set up a fundraising thing, which, again, Eleanor Roosevelt was involved in. Of course, the money was coming from the CIA. The money was just icing on the cake. But nonetheless, it was a good way of, getting the word out, trying to make the U.S. presence look benign. They were setting up health clinics, right? What could be more of it? So IRC was heavily involved in that, not in the actual Operation Brotherhood, which was a totally CIA operation, but in publicizing it, giving it a good name in the United States. And the other thing that Buttinger did when he came back is he set up this thing called American Friends of Vietnam, which was a propaganda organization to support the M. And it was so intertwined with the IRC that when they held meetings, they were trying to figure out, is it IRC, is it Friends of Vietnam, and who's what, and it was completely interlinked. But so they put out all kinds of pro-DM propaganda. DM was going to be a social reformer. He was going to do land reform. In other words, make him look like a social democrat when in fact he wasn't. And they got a lot of people involved. Norman Thomas was involved in this. Norman Thomas was the longtime presidential candidate of the Socialist Party, sort of Mr. Social Democrat in the United States. Norman Thomas supported this. JFK supported it. They had a lot of liberal, prominent progressives supporting it. And it was actually staffed. There was a PR organization called Harold Orem and that helped the IRC from the beginning. And they assigned somebody full-time to the American Friends of Vietnam, and it was paid for by DM. But then, of course, DM was getting its money from the United States government, so that was really being paid for the U.S. government. So what basically the U.S. government was running a psychological warfare program against its own populace. That's really what it comes down to. Trying to, what they call black propaganda, which make it seem like it's coming from an objective source, when in fact it's coming from actually two different governments, the United States government and DM. And I found that, again, a very interesting case study in what the IRC got involved in. American Friends of Vietnam didn't have anything remotely to do with refugees, but they were heavily involved. Churn was involved with the Duke, who was involved with the IRC, was president of the American Friends. So this is where you were talking about earlier about how Buttinger became disillusioned. Now, as time went on, DM became more and more autocratic. More and more people opposed him, not just the communists, but other groups who were opposing him. He threw them in jail. He was just as autocratic as the communists were. You didn't agree with him, off to jail you went. And this was pretty hard for Buttinger to swallow. But he did for several years. Even though he had personal reservations, he didn't like it. But publicly, he still defended DM, to the point that in 1959, he wrote an article in Dissent, which continued to praise DM. Now, this is 5 years after DM was in power, and by now everybody knew he was hardly a social democrat and extremely dictatorial. And Dissent, people know what Democratic Socialists of America is now. Yeah, right. It's an important part of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Well, it had its origins in the Socialist Party. It was one of the tendencies in the Socialist Party originally. And the Dissent people were very much involved with the leadership of that tendency. Dissent was funded heavily by Muriel Gardner. Muriel Gardner was Buttinger's wife. So, and she was an heiress to the Swift meatpacking. So she had big bucks. So a lot of interesting connections there. And eventually Buttinger, had enough, and he distanced himself from the end. But that was pretty late in the ball game. The U.S. Kennedy finally got rid of him. He was seen as a liability, and then they put a military junta in for a while. And the American Friends of Vietnam defended the military junta, but that's the final end of the story, is when LBJ started escalating the war in February 1965. I remember that very well. All of a sudden, I was a student in University of Michigan, and before then, the left was small. He started bombing North Vietnam, and all of a sudden, our rallies grew very big. Everybody could see which way that one was going. So they were going to get drafted and shipped off to Vietnam. Nobody liked that idea. Anyway, that really split the American Friends of Vietnam. That was too much. And then Ramparts exposed their ties to DM, and it fell apart. So that's the American Friends of Vietnam. But yeah, as I said before, one of the things that intrigued me about this whole IRC is watching people who were socialists sort of slowly integrate themselves into the mainstream, to the point at which Buttinger, he wasn't just defending DM, he was a close advisor to DM. He actually spent weeks in close consultation with them. God knows what they were talking about, but he was actually a close advisor for him. So how does somebody who was a leader of the socialist underground in Austria wind up being an advisor to a right-wing dictator in Vietnam? Anyway.
Yeah. Multiple things I want to comment on. There definitely, seems to be a theme, what you're saying about, at first it was just propaganda, then the, actual military took place, or, military action took place in Vietnam. There also seems to be that general theme within the CIA or U.S. intelligence about who's more in favor of propaganda and who's a little bit more of military action. And so I always find that pool very interesting. And, as you were saying, they started out more in the propaganda rhetoric and then went into more, aggressive military tactics. But if you could talk more about the propaganda with the IRC and in Vietnam, because it's really disgusting how it was hidden in the medical assistance that they received. And also, not hidden, so you can further expand on what I'm trying to say, but how, the IRC was supplying medical supplies, but also it came with propaganda pamphlets and different things. And obviously I think the US knew that providing medical assistance in and of itself can be good, propaganda, because people will say, oh, well, these people are actually giving us help. So of course, I'm going to be friendly with them. So, but that using medical humanitarian assistance as propaganda was pretty disgusting to me. But even though obviously it's needed, but the other thing I thought was interesting too is, I forget what they're called, but like the community centers that they created, which were essentially just hubs of propaganda information.
Right. Yeah. Now you're talking about Operation Brotherhood, which was endorsed by the IRC, but was not an IRC operation. It was a CIA operation. So, yeah, sure. The Lansdale had thought, and I guess he had used this already in the Philippines, that setting up health clinics would be great propaganda, and of course allows you a great place to collect intelligence as well. But you're right. Then the idea was, once that was established, we would set up these community centers where people would get basic literacy and stuff like that. And of course, they will also be fed a lot of pro-DM propaganda. So both would happen. Now, needless to say, the communist troops were well aware of what was going on. So they would target these places. But yeah, but that was the idea of Operation Brotherhood. Now, the IRC, in addition to propagandizing for it in the United States, the fundraising was to raise medical supplies that would then be given to the doctors who would set up these clinics. But let's not kid ourselves. The money was coming from the CIA. I mean, including for medical supplies. So this was just icing on the cake. That was the official argument, as they were collecting money for medical supplies to go to these doctors who would set up clinics. But it was all a CIA operation, and it was all funded by the U.S. government. So, yeah. And when you were raising, though, a broader point, which in Vietnam is less clear, one of the divisions within U.S. foreign policy, and intended to be between Democrats and Republicans, not entirely, but to what extent do you rely on military power versus what they call counterinsurgency? Now, in fact, in '54, under Eisenhower, who was a pretty conservative Republican, not like Trump, but pretty conservative, they were doing counterinsurgency. Right. So even though it wasn't Democrats, they were doing counterinsurgency. It wasn't like they didn't do it. They did do it. Nonetheless, the Kennedy people felt they weren't doing enough of it. There was too much emphasis on, build a bigger bomb rather than winning the hearts and souls of these, people in disputed countries. So that was one of the debates that went on. And so, of course, the IRC fit into that, right? Because to the extent that the people who want to do counterinsurgency won, that's exactly what the IRC did, right? They didn't build nuclear bombs. They were doing these kinds of programs. So, yeah, that was one of the underlying arguments that went on in U.S. foreign policy. And Kennedy, in his debates, made that quite explicit. That was one of the debates. He said, Eisenhower and thus Nixon, too reliant on nuclear weapons in trying to counter the Soviet Union, and not doing enough in terms of counterinsurgency to try and win the support of the grassroots people in these contested countries. That was part of the debate. Again, having said that, the Eisenhower administration flooded Saigon with CIA people in '54, and that's what they were doing as counterinsurgency. So it wasn't like, Eisenhower people didn't do that. They did do counterinsurgency, but Kennedy felt they weren't doing enough. They could be doing more. And that was the whole Green Beret kind of thing. And yeah, so that was one of the divisions within U.S. foreign policy establishment.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, that line that U.S. foreign policy had to try to walk because, they have propaganda both in America and, where else if abroad that they're having, military operations. They're propagandizing both, but then when sort of, for lack of a better word, shit hits the fan and people are realizing, moving to the bombing campaign in Vietnam, okay, this is not a humanitarian action, or a humanitarian intervention. So it's interesting how the U.S. tries to wrestle with their own propaganda because they want people to support them, but they're directly undermining their own value system and their actual actions. So how do they hide? How do they sort of walk this line and make people believe one thing, but still carry out their, foreign policy?
Well, you know what they did during Vietnam? They said, well, the Vietnamese people would like to just be left alone. And it's the Russians, the Soviets, and the Chinese who are intervening. They're providing the resources the North Vietnamese need to come and attack the South Vietnamese who just want to be left alone. I mean, that was the official ideology. Having said that, from 1954 on, people, including Leo Chern, who went to Vietnam, said, if there's an election, Diem's going to lose and the communists are going to win. Everybody said that. So they knew it was a lie, but that, that was the official propaganda. Is the left to themselves, the South Vietnamese would be independent of the North Vietnamese. And they was, North Vietnamese were aggressors and they were being aided by the Soviet Union and the Chinese and that kind of thing. It was a convenient argument. They knew it was a lie. But that's how they
yeah, even, British intelligence went in and said that it would be disastrous to prop up somebody, so even before the U.S. was really involved, there was already material out there that showed that.
That's true. But I think for a couple of things from LBJ's point of view, well, first, Kennedy was going to try to counterinsurgency thing. He believed in it, right? So he thought that would be worth trying. But from LBJ's point of view, I think there were two things. One, he made that quite explicitly. I'm not going to lose any country to the communists while I'm in the White House, because otherwise the Republicans are going to say, look, you put a Democrat in the White House, and what's the result? One more country goes communist. There's no way you're going to do that against me. I don't care what it takes. So that was one other thing. And two, even though they lost, the United States lost, they made a mess out of Vietnam. Still a mess. I mean, they're still finding mines, right? Agent Orange has led to childbirth defects even now. I mean, they made a mess out of Vietnam. So even though they were losing, they showed the United States had the power. Don't mess with us because we can really mess you up. And they showed that. So, I think those are the kinds of counters that it's true. They were told both by the French and the British, you're going to lose. It's too late. This war's lost. Forget it. And they still went in. But I think part of that was, we'll show them. We'll show them there's a very high cost in messing with the United States. And they did. They showed that. Now, of course, it also, and this is interesting, I came across a document Hubert Humphrey wrote as Johnson was escalating the war. He said, look, what you're going to do is you're going to radicalize a whole generation of young people. Do you really want to do this? Yeah. He was willing to do it. But Humphrey knew.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Mikey, I saw you writing some things down. Did you have a question? You're muted too, but okay.
I got it. Yeah. Well, I mean, these were more kind of final thought questions, but I mean, we are getting towards the end of this.
Yes, I think so. You do Cuba first and then do final thoughts or whatever.
Yeah, we can do that. Unless what a final thought you had goes along with what we're saying, but we can go to Cuba, Mikey.
Yeah, Cuba.
Okay.
Let's do that.
Let's go to
Cuba.
Yeah, let's go
Okay.
to Cuba.
All right. So Castro came to power in January 1st, 1959, and Chern went there a few months afterwards, allegedly looking for, as a refugee expert. But in fact, he wrote a report back to the powers that be, and he correctly said that Castro was moving towards communism. And so in 1960, they set up this Caribbean refugee settlement program. And they went to Alan Dulles, the CIA, and they asked for funding. And he said, give me a complete financial, what's it going to look like? That shows you how closely tied it was to. So they did it, and they set up IRC set up a program in both Miami and in New York, handled 100,000 refugees, was the biggest agency handling Cuban refugees. And some of those people were funneled to the group that invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. It's interesting. This was actually set up under Eisenhower. Eisenhower started the idea of invading Cuba. Kennedy inherited it, but he wasn't going to give it up. On the other hand, he didn't want it to seem like the invasion was the United States. It was a bunch of discontented Cubans. So it failed. And talk about things that there were people telling him, this is not going to work. This is way too late. Castro's already consolidated, and you're going to send 1,500 troops with minimal air support. Not a smart move. But, Kennedy felt he was already locked in, and they did it, and it was a complete disaster. And Dulles lost his job. But IRC was heavily involved in all that as well. When they introduced the Caribbean refugee program, one of the people at the press conference was this guy Sanchez Arango, who was the leader of one of the Cuban exile groups that was on this council that sponsored the invasion. So it couldn't be any clearer. I mean, really, not subtle. So that's the thing with the Cuban program.
Yeah, I just want to be clear because I said, IRC does tout Leo Chern, and he, is directly asking for money from the CIA, getting money for IRC in order to resettle these right-wing Cubans that are going to eventually, some of them are going to form this insurgency group.
Right. CIA sponsorship, of course.
Right.
They didn't do it spontaneously. The CIA was behind the invasion. But yeah, that's what happened.
Another thing I thought was interesting from that experience, just as a resettlement worker, is that they asked for more money once they actually were resettling Cubans in the United States, because it cost more money to, than they had originally anticipated, which I just find funny because, yes, it does take a lot of money to resettle a person to a different country. And that's something I don't think, the elites really think about in all of our programmatic funding, takes more money.
When Chern came with this program, that's probably what Alan Dulles was thinking. This is going to be an expensive project. I mean, Chern's saying, but Alan Dulles is thinking this is going to be an expensive project. Now, of course, the White House is saying, get rid of Cuba, get rid of Castro, overthrow him. Doesn't matter what the cost is. We want to get rid of him. So, open checkbook. But nonetheless, yeah, you're right. So it cost a lot of money. They had to come back for more money. And I'm sure Alan Dulles was saying, just what I thought. You guys are going to come back for more money. But on the other hand, he could go back to the White House and say, "Look, you guys told us, get it together. We need an invasion army. We're going to get rid of Castro. This is what it costs. It's an expensive project." So.
Another thing, I guess more into final thoughts, but IRC nefarious activities. You point out. Look at where the U.S. decides to invade or go to war, and look where IRC is. Now they have expanded to quite, like I said, they're in 40 countries, but definitely in their inception and quite, for some years, they are, wherever the U.S. is engaging in military activity, they're going to be there.
Yeah, well, it wasn't initially focused on Europe. That was the idea. During World War II, and then immediate post-war period, it was focused on Europe. What made them a global organization was Vietnam, and the U.S. specifically asked the IRC to get involved in Vietnam, even though it was not their thing. But they did it, and once they started doing that, of course, they opened it up, and it became. One of the things, going back and looking at my book, I just began to talk about the Middle East because that was really peripheral to the early IRC. But of course now that's where it's at. So that would be interesting, to somebody do a follow-up on how the IRC got involved. I'm sure it's quite complicated, as Middle Eastern politics are quite complicated, and the U.S. is trying to figure out exactly who to ally with. That's pretty complicated. But I hadn't realized until I read the book again, the IRC had helped the Kurds back in 1990 and got the U.S. to help the Kurds. And here we are 30 years later, and they're still doing the same thing. So, yeah. But you're right. Generally, the IRC went where the American government wanted to. Not now, as you say, it's a global operation. It's also huge. At that time, it wasn't that big. It's a different kind of thing. But initially, that's where that's what they did. They were an arm. In effect, they were implicitly an arm of the U.S. government. They were heavily funded through the government. They tried to cooperate with the U.S. government. And having said that, this was not a proprietary. The National Committee for Free Europe was strictly a CIA operation. The IRC is more complicated. They want to help refugees. I'm sure Leah Chern, I'm sure when he went home, so I feel good. I'm helping refugees, but at the same time, they wanted to cooperate with the government, with the CIA. They had to balance that. So, that's what makes it interesting to look at.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of IRC's relationship with the CIA. And, if you want to add some more key points, you can. But I just want to say that, again, in trying to move the needle in humanitarian efforts, and, I tried to do that through IRC, and there are probably other avenues that I could have taken to maybe, I don't know. But what I'm just trying to say that it's much harder than I think the average person realizes to change these institutions, organizations, because of the connections that they have to U.S. intelligence or, elites. And, it's a global operation. So I'm sure that their connections, and, they started out in Europe, they clearly have access to elites across the globe. And all of the people on the board at the top of IRC, these people are kind of interchangeable with other politicians, as we see now with David Miliband. They're not workers like myself who have been in the industry and somehow work your way up and you get to be CEO of IRC. That's not how it works. So, just to point out that there is this elite system that makes real humanitarian change in any capacity very difficult. And, we should be cautious when we hear IRC throw around progressive rhetoric and change, because we know that they are very, in line with U.S. foreign policy.
Absolutely.
So how much are they really going to change?
No, they're not going to change. That's even less so now than it was before. If you look at their board of directors, and aside from former government officials, a whole lot of big-time corporate executives. It used to be lefties of various sorts. I don't see any of them now. Instead, it's corporate executives and former government officials. So, in terms of aligning with U.S. foreign policy, that part is obvious. That's just clear. With the intelligence community, it's more complicated because obviously it's secret. And we don't really know what's going on with the IRC. But I have to say that when I see Henry Kissinger as one of those on the advisory group, well, it does make me wonder, because as National Security Advisor to Nixon, he would have been aware of all the covert operations. So, yeah, so it does make you wonder. Also, another thing, I went on their website, and as you point out, they generate huge sums of money. They openly say they're getting money from EU, from the UK, Ireland, but I could see no mention of the United States government, none. The likelihood of them not getting any money from the U.S. government, very, very unlikely. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, they definitely. That's interesting because I'm pretty sure 80% of their funding is government funding now, but obviously some of their funding has to be from U.S. government because they're getting money from federal like Bureau for Population, Refugees and Migrants, and also ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement. These are, federal government entities that provide the IRC money in order to carry out relief refugee resettlement work. So they definitely are.
I'm sure they are getting it, but I just point out that you go to their website, there's no mention of it at all. There's mention of other governments, but not of the United States government. So these all are kinds of things that make me feel rather suspicious, but of course I have no idea of really knowing. They could be totally clean. It could be what they claim it is, just a bunch of people helping refugees. But given their history and given some of the people on the advisory board, Madeleine Albright, well, anyway, who knows? We'll see. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when the papers are open, we'll have a better idea of where the IRC fits into the foreign policy establishment.
Yeah. Well, talking about their current state of affairs in the Middle East, I mean, David Miliband, his first week in office at the IRC, advocated for military humanitarian intervention into Syria. And obviously he's somebody that directly benefits from a refugee pipeline, however it's created. So yeah, I would say that, they're still in line with U.S. foreign policy, and
that part's clear. I don't think anybody, the question is whether they're still in line with the intelligence community. That's the different question, but one we can't really answer. But yeah, I guess one of the things being on this program, I'm sure there are people listening who are either working for the IRC or considering working for the IRC. And I would urge them to read my book before, to think about what it is, what organization they've become part of or are thinking of becoming part of. Because even if things are different now, the fact that this could go on for 20, 25 years, worth thinking about.
Right. Absolutely. I definitely encourage everybody to read your book and think about, in holding the IRC accountable even for past wrongdoings, all of the chaos, all of the, the things that they've done wrong to the Vietnamese people or to, Eastern Europeans, or the way they've manipulated their programming to allow CIA have access to them or feed them propaganda, the various ways you've laid out. I mean, these are things that we should be aware of as employees and say, is there ever going to be any kind of like restitution, reparations, an apology, something for these nefarious activities that an international humanitarian organization is engaging in,
I agree. It would make me feel a lot better about the current organization if it was honest about its past. But
absolutely.
As far as I know, when I wrote that book, nobody responded. Nobody. It wasn't even they say you lied. They didn't even say, they just ignored it. So, and as you point out, I make some pretty serious charges about what the IRC was doing. It don't sound like a refugee organization. So the fact that they ignored it is not a good sign. So that would seem, I agree with you. A good start would be to say, all right, we're going to actually set up a commission to look at what did the IRC do during the Cold War?
Mm-hmm.
What did it do, and how do we make sure that in the future, going further, we are actually a refugee organization, not a front for the CIA? So that would seem like a good start. So maybe we'll see, huh? So,
Yeah.
what could be wrong, right?
Well, and before we get into final thoughts and stuff, I just do want to thank you for all the work that you put into this book and how appreciative I am. It sort of validated a lot of my, quote unquote trauma with IRC and, my feelings towards them. So I just appreciate the book that you explicitly talking about IRC, but just all the research that you put into it and, giving real correspondence, taking from real documents. It's just, yeah, it's a great book. So definitely recommend it to everybody. And thank you for doing it.
I actually enjoy doing that kind of stuff. So not a sacrifice. I enjoy it, but I've always been curious. Anyway, so Mikey, we're at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. Well, first of all, we want to say that this is just part one, so we're going to have Eric back next week. He's got some newer work that we're going to delve into a little bit. Let's see if I can pull this up.
Wobblies in their hate. Oh, this one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
is this your most recent book?
That's the most recent one.
So, Free Speech and the Suppression of Dissent During World War I. And this has some crossover, I think, with the other book. And we'll get into this a little bit next week. But also, if you want like a full dive into that, we would recommend checking out the Red Library podcast that Eric did. It was very good and very interesting. And then we'll sort of segue into his other book, which is also a more recent book than the IRC book, Wobblies in Their Heyday, which also goes back into the World War I era and has some crossover, I think, with the free speech and suppression of dissent. And then we're going to sort of follow the story of labor into the AFL-CIO and have another guest, Dan Kovalik, who was in episode 2, talk a little bit about how the CIA is also involved with the AFL-CIO and how they operated during the Cold War. In some ways similar to the IRC, I think. So, yeah, I think that's good for that announcement. As far as some of my final thoughts, I'm not sure where to begin at the, contemporary or go back to the beginning. I guess I'll start with contemporary. So a lot of this research sort of drops off in the 80s because that's when, or before that really even, because you were doing the research in the 80s and the archival material was still coming out. So as we mentioned, we don't know exactly what's going on now. But if you look at everything that happened with IRC and the patterns and some of the stuff we'll get in next week with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, it really leaves you in this place of kind of despair where it's like, who do you trust when it comes particularly to regime change abroad, wars, and what you're hearing at home as a Westerner, as an American, in the moment in particular. Like, it's easier to look back at Iraq even, which wasn't that long ago, and see how we were misled in all these different ways. But right now we're dealing with Syria and Ukraine and Venezuela and all these different things all over the world. There's, is it Belarus, I think too, that is experiencing some, instability at this time, and you're hearing different narratives, and it's very difficult to know what to believe. And it's just unfortunate that some of these groups that we should be able to trust to give us on the ground information have been involved in essentially state-sponsored propaganda campaigns that were full of lies that just weren't true in retrospect. So, in general, I'm like, as a fairly far left person, I have this sort of anti-American sentiment, I guess you could say, but I try not to apply that to every situation. I think there could be situations where humanitarian intervention is needed, maybe even militarily, but it's just so hard to know what to trust because we just get lied to over and over again. So that's one of my takeaways. The other thing is the development of the IRC and how the progressive progressive institution went from having some socialist influence to over time becoming this very mainstream. You could hardly call it liberal. It depends on what your definition of liberal is. This very contemporary United States version of liberalism, you could say sort of neoliberalism, tracks very much with a lot of the development of the broader liberal left in America and sort of the Democratic base of voters, which is frustrating in a lot of ways because we, as broader, further left people, I think we share a lot in common with liberals, but there's this long-standing, issues between the further left and the more center or liberal people. And as far as with IRC and the development and where we are today, for me, one of the biggest things is foreign policy. And it's like, there's a much broader alliance ready to do social democratic policies like healthcare, maybe free college, other things like that. But when you start getting into like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be supporting, radical, basically terrorist groups all over the world to undermine a government that we think maybe is friendly to Putin's Russia or whatever. That's when, especially in the Obama forward era and into the Trump era, liberals are not trying to hear that anymore. Like, for instance, liberals are very largely in support of the Syrian war. And they're very largely, because I think of a lot of this Russiagate stuff and everything, then the narrative has shifted into trusting the security state. Whatever the CIA says or whatever the FBI says, they go on MSNBC or CNN or whatever, and liberals are like, yeah, this is great, largely because they're saying, what they want to hear about Trump being a bad guy, and that resurgence of the sort of security state and the broader liberal left alliance is disturbing to me, I think. And one thing I've realized more lately with this book and like really thinking about it more, and you sort of reminded me of Arthur Schlesinger's like actual background, is that this shouldn't be surprising because this is kind of the roots of American liberalism. They've always been sort of on the side of the American security state, and it was largely derived from their anti-communist stance. But now like I said, we're way past the Cold War now. There's no real communist threat. So like we're still operating on this same sort of thing where liberals are like becoming totally enamored with the just sort of standard Washingtonian view on foreign policy and like how the security state's totally good. You should trust everything the CIA says, which is just kind of crazy to me. So that's basically my spiel on my closing thoughts, I think.
I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. But, I want to put it one step further. I don't know if you'll agree with me there. I get nervous. It was an ugly scene what happened in the Capitol. But when you start saying that you're going to make whole organizations illegal, or you're going to say that if you speak at a rally and a bunch of people leave that rally and start doing something, whatever, illegal, you're responsible. You're heading down some very dangerous paths that have been used against the left historically. So I think this goes into our next episode, free speech. But I'm nervous by the ways too many liberals in their anxiety to get at Trump are not really paying a whole lot of attention to free speech. I mean, take an example, QAnon, a ridiculous, absurd theory. Nonetheless, people have the perfect right to state it. They have the perfect right to run for Congress on that basis. I mean, it's ludicrous, but they have the right to do it. And it's wrong to say that people should be excluded from Congress because they're nutballs. Because frankly, what we consider to be nutballs, they can, other people, I mean, that's just not a good idea. And it's been done in the past. Victor Berger was one of the leaders of the Socialist Party, was elected to Congress and excluded by Congress, removed from his post because he opposed the war. They said that was seditious, which by their definition it was. So we're heading down a very dangerous path when we head down that way. And I get quite nervous. I mean, that's not to say that people have the right to storm the Capitol and start beating up people. That's not free speech. That's well beyond free speech. You don't even have the right to threaten people and threaten to kill them. That's not free speech either. But you do have the right to come up with all kinds of crazy ideas. QAnon being about as absurd as you can think of. But, there are other examples, or take probably a more dangerous one, anti-Semitic comments. We know how dangerous that is. Nonetheless, if you start saying that people can't say things like that, it's going to boomerang. It's going to boomerang. And I'm very nervous about what's going on right now when I read some of the stuff that liberals are saying. You talk about a security state. Well, there's also a domestic security state, right? The FBI and NSA and all that kind of stuff. And of course, it's primarily been directed at the left. But right now, the right is, the plot du jour. And we ought to be pretty wary about that. And not to say that they, have the right to beat up people. They don't. That's beyond free speech. But it goes beyond that. People are really saying that, you can't say certain things. You can't say certain things. Those are beyond the bounds of what you can say. And I think that is very contrary to free speech. And the fact that they're a bunch of right-wing kooks doesn't make it any different. Free speech is for everybody. If it's not for everybody, it's for nobody. Rosa Luxemburg said it very well. Free speech is for those who think differently. In this case, it's a bunch of right-wing kooks. But that's the way it is. And I think we ought to, so we'll talk more about this next time. But when you were saying that about the security state, I had that feeling too domestically.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. And it makes me real nervous.
Yeah, this is funny. All this stuff is really right up my alley. I don't know if you know that, my sort of research background, I'm not exactly a scholar, but I have a master's in art and design. And I wrote a thesis that was very interdisciplinary. It was about conspiracy theories and propaganda and the rise of anti-Semitic propaganda, the connections to these things, to fascist propaganda. And that I saw that this was before Trump even, that there was a problem with this. I didn't know exactly how it was going to manifest, but I could tell that it was growing a lot. But also, I have a lot of strong feelings about free speech. And when I first got interested in this stuff, I started reading about Holocaust denial, and I sort of came down on the side that, this is sort of an anecdote. It doesn't necessarily prove anything, but there is, some anecdotal evidence that societies that allow people to talk about Holocaust and don't outlaw it have lower rates of Holocaust denial. That could be because, the societies that are denying the Holocaust or making it illegal are like Germany and stuff like that. So it's not necessarily surprising that they would have higher rates. But still, it's something I believe in. I'm pretty much a free speech absolutist, but I would say, recent events have been kind of testing the limits of these kind of things especially with COVID. And, it's really tough to say, when somebody is causing the public harm with misinformation, but I don't see labeling something as Twitter or banning the president from Twitter or any of these kind of things as the solution. And this is going to be in the final episode, I think, of my series about all this conspiracy theories and left strategy in this environment, which is that, the big picture is we have to fight back against these things with more sophisticated measures than brute force and censorship. We have to win the war of ideas. There's no going around that battle. And I think people really are not understanding that on the broader liberal to left spectrum. And it makes it hard to have conversations about these things. And there's a really big dust up about all this stuff, different fractures, and I am concerned, and not just about the censorship, about the security state, your stuff you were talking about. And, I have two minds about it, because I think some people on the left, they're underestimating how dangerous these QAnon people are and what it could turn into. But I also think the liberal establishment is going to use this event and push it way farther than it needs to be pushed in terms of using it to increase cracking down on not just free speech, but in general political dissent, and sort of like upping on the Patriot Act and all the domestic surveillance and everything we already have. There was actually somebody made a statement just the other day that I think it was a former intelligence person that said we need counterinsurgency measures similar to what we used in the Middle East and Iraq and Afghanistan here at home to fight these hillbilly QAnon people. And it's like, no, we don't. That might sound good to some
Chickens
liberals.
are coming home.
Yeah, but that, like you said, it's going to be used against the left. It always has been, and it's only a matter of time before it will come all the way back on the left again.
Yeah, I agree with you. And beyond that, I should say I'm for free speech as a matter of principle. Even if it didn't come back on the left, I'd still be for it, because I believe in free speech. It's an important fundamental right, and it's the kind of, I want to live in a society which maximizes the discourse, not minimizes it. And some people aren't going to like what other people say. That's just the way things are. Got to live with it. So I think these are important points, and I agree with what you're saying. The establishment liberals are using this not only to increase the security state, but also to beat down any kind of position to their left. Because they can say, well, if you're doing this, you're dividing us, we're confronting these right-wing terrorist types, and we need your support. So, people on the left who play into that, they're really just making it even harder than it is already in the United States to have a position to the left of Biden or whatever, So I think that's not the road to go down. Anyway, we should probably talk about this next time.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Eric, and we'll see you again next week. And thank you so much for your work and all of your insight in this conversation. And I hope everybody enjoyed it. So stay tuned for next week. We'll be sending out another advertisement and email alerts and all that good stuff to let you all know when it'll be. So stay tuned. Okay.
All right. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon, Eric. We'll send you an email, and we'll see you next week. All right.
Okay.
Take care. All right. Great show, I think. And looking forward to next week.
Yes. Everybody, I encourage you to read Eric Chester's book, Covert Network, and all of his books, so you can get prepared for next week as well. But thank you again. Everybody is joining. And I hope this makes you think twice about humanitarian organizations, obviously the IRC. And if you work for the IRC or are thinking about working for the IRC, please listen, please share, and think about ways that we could hold the IRC accountable. If you have ideas, please send them to contrarianhumanitarian@gmail.com. There's also a place you can do it on our website, contrarianhumanitarian.org. So let us know what you think and how we could hold IRC accountable and ensure that refugee resettlement agencies are actually working for the betterment of refugees and not themselves.
All right, let's wrap it up. I'm going to throw on the music and say goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Welcome to Contrarian Humanitarian, your blog and podcast for all things international development, analyzing global injustices and building solutions for a better world.